Due to the graphic nature of this program, viewer discretion is advised.
The White House, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, is not only the epicenter of the most powerful man in America, it's also the epicenter for some paranormal activity. Everyone from White House staff to the First Ladies have experienced some specters in the White House, and it's not just dead presidents that make their appearance. Former First Lady Abigail Adams has made a ghostly guest spot on occasion, dressed in a lace shawl and a cap, on her way to the East Room to do her laundry. Being the driest place in the White House during their stay in the late 18th century, she used to hang her clothes to dry, and she still does. Disembodied voices from other major White House personalities have also been heard floating through the Yellow Oval Room. First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln, who held seances in the White House in order to speak with her dead sons, claims to have heard Andrew Jackson causing up a storm in the halls, and particularly around the Rose Room, which used to be his bedroom. His ghost is said to have turned up at Harry Truman's White House correspondence. Truman sent a letter to his wife detailing the eerie atmosphere. "I sit here in this old house and work on foreign affairs, read reports, and work on speeches, all the while listening to the ghosts walk up and down the hallway, and even right here in the study. The floors pop and the drapes move back and forth. I can just imagine old Andy Jackson and Teddy Roosevelt having an argument over Franklin Roosevelt. Lincoln's ghost or presence is most often cited. First Lady Grace Coolidge claims to have seen his lanky specter starting out in the Oval Office. Lady Bird Johnson and Eleanor Roosevelt also claim to have felt Lincoln's presence. The Netherlands Queen Wilhelma was staying in the White House when she answered a knock at her door in the middle of the night to find Lincoln's ghost, top hat and all, floating before her. She was so shocked she fainted. Even British Prime Minister Winston Churchill claims to have encountered the ghost at the fireplace in his room. Not only does his ghost appear, but Lincoln himself had premonitions in the haunted White House. Not long before he was assassinated, he had a dream in which he foresaw his passing. Perhaps he should have been more superstitious.
Washington's Capitol building is rich in folklore and ghost stories. Since its inception, rumors of spiritual unrest have circulated, with visitors and employees reporting supernatural experiences. Commonly, people hear strange footsteps in empty halls and chambers. After the Civil War, ghost sightings increased, including those of Abraham Lincoln, demon cats, and other specters. General John A. Logan's ghost has been seen emerging from the room once used by the Committee on Military and Militia, which he chaired and is now the House Armed Services Committee. Witnesses report hearing him shuffle papers and close the door, still in uniform and displaying the same determination as in life, before disappearing into a wall. In the Senate's portico, the ghost of Osborne, an old janitor who died around 1891, has been seen scrubbing floors. People have heard him cleaning and have seen his shadowy form at work, even during daylight hours. The basement of the House of Representatives is known for its foreign-looking ghost, a tall man with a mustache and goatee. He walks the corridors with his hands clasped behind his back, ignoring calls and vanishing when approached. The basement was once considered the most haunted part of the building. Night watchmen were once armed, but a prank in 1882 ended this practice. A new watchman, scared by a colleague dressed as a ghost, fired his revolver in panic, though he missed due to trembling. This incident led to a ban on guns for watchmen. One of the Capitol's most famous haunts is the demon cat, first formally recorded in 1862 when a workman shot at it. This spectral feline can change size from a domestic cat to a panther. In the 1880s, the Capitol Dome gained a reputation for hauntings. Watchmen reported seeing shadowy figures, and one elderly watchman claimed to have witnessed a melancholy man jump to his death from the highest rail, a 200-foot plunge. Jake Galloway, a longtime night watchman, was deeply interested in the paranormal. After his passing in the early 1900s, his colleagues discussed his fascination. Galloway used a spirit horn to communicate with ghosts, claiming to hear speeches from long-dead founders. He believed in a conspiracy that, had Lincoln's assassination failed, would have involved blowing up both the House and Senate. The conspirators supposedly smuggled the dynamite out of the Capitol disguised as waste paper. President James A. Garfield was assassinated on July 2, 1881, by Charles Guiteau, a failed attorney turned minister. Guiteau's erratic behavior during his trial included delivering testimony in the form of an epic poem, cursing the judge, and seeking legal advice from strangers. He believed he would be acquitted and began planning a presidential campaign. Guiteau was executed at the gallows outside the old Capitol prison. His ghost is said to haunt the Capitol, along with that of a headless convict named Stone, who was decapitated by the noose during his execution due to his prodigious size. The White House and Capitol building continue to be hotspots for ghostly tales and supernatural occurrences from President Garfield's time to recent years. After Garfield's assassination, the White House saw an increase in ghostly activity. President Chester A. Arthur, who succeeded Garfield, reported strange noises and felt an eerie presence. The ghost of Abigail Adams, the second First Lady, has been seen in the East Room, hanging laundry as she did in her lifetime. The Capitol building also remained a hub of spectral activity. In the early 20th century, workers and visitors frequently reported encounters with the spirits of past politicians and soldiers. One of the most notable hauntings involved the ghost of Vice President Henry Wilson, who died in the Capitol in 1875. Witnesses claim to have seen Wilson wandering the halls, looking forlorn and lost. In the mid-20th century, the White House underwent significant renovations under President Truman. During this time, construction workers reported seeing the ghost of a man in a black coat and hat, believed to be President Lincoln, supervising the work. More recently, the Capitol building has been the site of numerous ghostly sightings, including that of a mysterious black cat, which appears before national tragedies or significant events. Dubbed the Demon Cat, it has been reported before events like the stock market crash of 1929 and the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. In the 21st century, the White House continues to be a focus of paranormal interest. Staff and visitors have reported seeing the ghosts of President Lincoln and First Lady Dolly Madison. Lincoln's ghost is said to appear during times of national crisis, while Madison is believed to protect the Rose Garden, which she helped design. These stories contribute to the rich tapestry of history and folklore surrounding these iconic American buildings, making them not only symbols of political power, but also of enduring mystery and intrigue. It's difficult to imagine an opulent plantation once stood where the Pan American Union building is today. This structure, also known as the Association of American States, was built directly atop one of the nation's most famous and historic homes. The legends of the Van Ness Mansion have endured through centuries, remaining just as fascinating today. The story of the Van Ness Mansion is deeply intertwined with early American history. Long before the Van Ness Mansion, a four-room log cabin stood on the property. David Burns, who owned much of what would become Washington, D.C., built this cabin in 1748. His farmland eventually housed structures like the National Mall, the Smithsonian Institution, the National Museum, the Treasury Building, the Old Post Office Pavilion, the White House, the Washington State Capitol, and the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. Lafayette Square was known as Burns' Apple Orchard a century and a half ago. Burns's property stretched from Capitol Hill to modern-day Georgetown. Burns entertained early American heroes such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton. Known as Obstinate Davy, he famously haggled with George Washington, who wanted his land for the capital city. After much back and forth, Washington threatened Burns with eminent domain, and Burns reluctantly conceded. He is remembered as one of the few who sassed George Washington and entertained presidents from Washington to Jackson. Burns and his wife Anne had a daughter, Marcia, and a son, John. Marcia attended the finest schools and grew into a bright young lady. The family faced hardships in the 1790s when John died unexpectedly at 20. Burns himself died in 1799, the same year as President Washington. He left his daughter, the richest girl in the nation. Despite his peaceful demise, legends say Burns is one of the spectral guests haunting the White House today. Marcia became a wealthy heiress, attracting many suitors, but she chose New York Congressman John Peter Van Ness, a young politician and Aaron Burr's protege. John's brother, William, was Burr's second in the infamous Hamilton duel. Van Ness, elected to the 6th Congress in 1800 at age 28, married Marcia in 1802 when she was 22. They began their life together in Burns's cottage. A contemporary described John as well-bred, well-read, and well-fed. However, his political success did not last. His New York constituents grew resentful of his time in Washington. Even his marriage and residency in Washington didn't soften their resentment. In 1803, the same year his daughter Anne Albertina was born, his constituents and officials worked to have him expelled from Congress, and he lost his position. Despite this loss, their lifestyle remained unaffected. Burns had left his daughter a significant amount of valuable Washington property. As real estate values skyrocketed, the Van Ness family became extremely wealthy. Anne, like her mother, attended the finest schools and enjoyed all available luxuries. John Van Ness, recognizing his daughter Anne's growth, decided to build a legendary family home. The Van Ness Mansion, among the first buildings in Washington, D.C., cost $60,000, over $723,700 today. Celebrated architect Benjamin Henry Bonneval Latrobe, designer of the Washington Canal and St. John's Episcopal Church, planned the mansion. Constructed between 1813 and 1816 on the Potomac River, the mansion was the only brick structure between Norfolk and Baltimore besides Washington's Mentee, Vernon. Burns's original cottage remained beside the new mansion. The house's peculiar design, with odd turns and secret passages, fueled many rumors. The mansion, a brick structure with a stucco exterior often painted yellow, featured a north portico modeled after the White House with identical pillars. The south side faced the river with a colonnaded portico. 2 stone lodges guarded the front entrance, and a wide drive lined with elm and ash trees led to the house. The English basement, partially above ground, housed the kitchen, storage rooms, servants' quarters, and wine vaults. The primary floor had elaborate parlors, a formal dining room, library, and conservatory overlooking the fruit orchard. The upper story contained the family's private chambers. Rare woodwork adorned the home, with white marble mantels by Danish sculptor Bertel Thorvaldsen, Spanish azulejos tiles, Turkish carpets, and historic tapestries added to the mansion's opulence, which even included hot and cold running water. Unique red mortar, more durable than early 20th century concrete, was used in construction, though its formulation was lost over time. The home was completed as Anne finished school, and Marcia ensured her father's cottage remained on the estate. Van Ness, a horse enthusiast, maintained stables of the finest white steeds. Anne grew into a beautiful young lady like her mother, and soon became betrothed to Arthur Middleton of South Carolina, whose father signed the Declaration of Independence. The couple married around 1821, but the union was short-lived. Anne and her infant daughter, Helen, died shortly after childbirth on November 22, 1823, and were buried together. Devastated, Marcia withdrew from social life and devoted herself to humanitarian efforts, notably the Washington City Orphan Asylum, which she founded in 1815. After Anne's death, she spent even more time in her work and turned a room in her father's cottage into a private chapel for daily meditation and prayer. She died in 1832, nearly a decade after Anne, and was the first woman honored with a public funeral. Her charitable efforts had touched many, including orphans who had grown into successful adults. Major Van Ness, grief-stricken, built a lavish mausoleum modeled after the Roman Temple of Vesta, spending $34,000. The memorial was on H Street, near the Ascension Episcopalian Church, which operated only in 1862 and 1863. Van Ness lived to 76, dying in 1846. After his death, a mysterious woman from Philadelphia claimed they had secretly married. Though she had love letters from Van Ness, she couldn't prove the marriage, leading to a legal battle with distant heirs who suspected her of blackmail. Life at the Van Ness mansion wasn't always somber. Angie Wright, known as Sister Gertrude, was Marcia's cousin. Raised in the Georgetown convent while her parents lived in Europe, she grew to love convent life and chose to become a nun. She remained at the convent until around age 30. When the Mother Superior died, she expected to be chosen as her successor but wasn't. Feeling disappointed and rejected, she fled the convent in a monk's frock and sought refuge at the Van Ness mansion. 2 priests visited to persuade her to return, but she refused. Embracing her new life, she became a socialite, enjoying dinner parties and conversations at the estate. She was respected for her intellect and adored the pageantry of the mansion, though she remained a Roman Catholic despite leaving the convent. The Van Ness mansion sat empty for years after Sister Gertrude left. The heirs, unsure what to do with the estate, eventually agreed to sell it. In 1850, Thomas Green purchased the home and moved his family in. He repaired David Burns's cottage and restored the mansion to its former glory. The Civil War brought scandal and terror to the Greens. Rumors of paranormal activity multiplied, and even President Abraham Lincoln reportedly discussed the home's dancing spirits. The Green family survived the war relatively unscathed, but Lincoln's assassination brought federal authorities to their door. Rumors surged that the Van Ness mansion had been John Wilkes Booth's headquarters. According to the story, Booth and his conspirators originally planned to abduct Lincoln and imprison him in one of the mansion's wine vaults before smuggling him to a southern state. These suspicions led to the imprisonment of Green and his wife in the old Capitol prison, but the rumors proved baseless, and they were released. Many Southerners at the time emphatically denounced Lincoln's assassination, as they disliked Vice President Johnson much more. This led to a growing theory that Lincoln's rivals and enemies in Washington orchestrated the events at a time when public assumption would direct blame to the most obvious culprits. This is a startling parallel to the assassination of JFK, a president with whom Lincoln is often compared. After the Green family moved out, the Van Ness mansion saw a steady succession of caretakers. The next owner, Governor Thomas Swan of Maryland, never lived there and relied on caretakers to maintain the property. Many questioned if previous inhabitants ever left. On the anniversary of General Van Ness's death, a carriage pulled by 6 headless white horses galloped around the home at midnight. The mansion often echoed with footsteps and knocking, and a ghostly woman in period costume moved through the halls calling to other specters. An annual phantom celebration reportedly took place, with specters in colonial attire dancing to ethereal music in the ballroom. The city moved the mausoleum to Oak Hill Cemetery, auctioning the lot in June 1872. Rumors claimed 7 bodies were in the chamber, but dates carved on the mausoleum were inaccurate. David, Anne, and John Burns were buried in the White graveyard. David Burns died in 1799, not 1800, and John Burns was alive in October 1793, disproving his death date of 1792. By the 1890s, the estate was endangered as the surrounding neighborhood, known as the Sink, fell into poverty and crime. Malaria epidemics plagued residents due to the river's proximity. A caretaker's wife once saw Marcia Van Ness's ghost instructing her to visit a northeastern part of the city. But her husband found only a vacant lot. Obstinate Davies Cottage was demolished on May 23, 1894. George Washington University bought the estate in November 1902, planning to restore the mansion as a temporary school of engineering, but the plans fell through. The Bureau of American Republics purchased the property in 1908, leading to the mansion's demolition for the Pan American Union building. Despite its destruction, rumors persist that Van Ness's ghostly carriage still circles the Pan American building, pulled by headless white horses. The Pan American Union building, constructed in 1910 on the site of the former Van Ness mansion, is steeped in ghostly legends and strange events. Visitors and employees alike report eerie occurrences, attributing them to spirits from the mansion's past. One of the most famous ghost stories involves a carriage pulled by 6 headless white horses, said to appear at midnight on the anniversary of General John Peter Van Ness's death. Witnesses claim to hear the phantom horses galloping around the building, a spectral tribute to Van Ness's love for his steeds. Inside the building, strange sounds and apparitions have been reported. Footsteps echo through empty hallways, doors open and close by themselves, and disembodied voices whisper in the night. Some have seen a ghostly woman in period clothing, believed to be Marcia Van Ness, wandering the halls and calling out to other spirits. She is often spotted near where the mansion's grand ballroom once stood, perhaps longing for the lavish parties she once hosted. Another common sighting is that of a group of spectral figures dressed in colonial attire, seemingly engaged in an eternal celebration. These ghostly guests have been seen dancing to ethereal music in the vicinity of the original ballroom, continuing a tradition of grandeur long after their time. Even more unsettling, some have experienced sudden drops in temperature and felt an inexplicable sense of dread in certain areas of the building. Paranormal investigators frequently visit the Pan American Union building, drawn by its rich history and the persistent tales of ghostly activity. The spectral lore of the site endures, adding an aura of mystery to this historic landmark in Washington, D.C.
We're in the East Room of the White House right now, and we'll be moving towards the North Portico. On my left is the staircase that comes up from the ground floor. As I pass through this portico area here, or this vestibule, you see two doors here on either side of me. These doors are open 24 hours a day, never locked, and in the open position without being closed. There were three of us standing here in the vicinity of these doors, and we felt a cold rush of air pass through us. It seemed like it came from the staircase and from these doors. The doors, after we felt the cold rush of air, came slowly closed, something that none of us had ever seen before. And we proceeded to the North Portico doors and looked to see if maybe somebody had opened the doors and created a vacuum, or possibly had somebody opened a door downstairs. We looked in both areas, didn't find any explanation for why these doors that are open on a 24-hour-a-day circumstance would all of a sudden close. That's one of the mysteries of the White House, and some people wonder if that may have been Lincoln's ghost that went through.
The Hoodoo House had a variety of names while it stood in Washington. For a time, it was the Tracy House, and then it was the Tyler House. 3 buildings had occupied the most cursed location in Washington's history, just through 1910. An English stonemason built the original cottage in 1792 as a wedding present to his bride. He came to Washington to work on the Capitol building's foundation. When the cottage was complete, he returned to England and married his beloved. The couple returned to Washington and remained one of the happiest in the region. She became famous for her beautiful, long, golden hair. She was such a beauty that the stonemason regularly brought his friends to see her. She walked to the front gate with him every morning when he left for work and met him there when he returned. The couple's contentment was too brief. Irrational jealousy drove the stonemason insane. He came home one afternoon and told his wife he had to work a few extra hours that evening. He left after supper, but he just went down the road and waited. No one came or left the home while he watched, but he still crept to the window after dark. Something happened when he peered in the cracks. He snapped and tore through the shutters and the glass. His unexpected rage terrified her. She tried to flee to the upper floor. He caught her by her long hair as she ran up the steps and brought a stone hammer down upon her head. He crushed her skull. He dragged her corpse down the steps and out the front door. He left her body partially under a thicket by the road and wandered off. No one knew where he went or what he did after the crime. He made no effort to hide the scene or even close the front door. He didn't take any belongings with him. Her body left a trail of gore wherever he dragged it. The infamous thicket later became the old garden for the Corcoran House, across from the old Army and Navy Club and the Rochambeau apartment house. No one suspected anything for days. Eventually, several neighbors grew worried and decided to visit. He was never seen leaving for work, and his wife was never seen waiting for him. They found the front door open. Pools of blood had dried in the path left by the body. Some even wondered if a robbery had gone wrong, and the stonemason was taken by force. The mason wandered back into the area several years later, where he was apprehended, convicted, and hanged. He confessed to the crime but never provided a motive. Authorities could only guess as to what happened. Whatever he witnessed that night will forever remain a mystery. The house sat empty for years, its history nearly forgotten. until a wealthy congressman's son purchased and renovated the cottage. He lived there with his common-law wife. The couple preferred a fast lifestyle with wild parties and luxuries they couldn't afford. It was only a matter of time before he amassed a tremendous amount of gambling debt. He grew so embroiled in financial obligations that he forged checks from a family friend. The family friend confronted him in a club in front of all the friends he paid so much to keep. He couldn't take the humiliation of everyone knowing he was on the verge of financial and legal ruin. He bolted from the club and ran to the little cottage where he attacked his wife. He blamed her and the rest of his family for his situation. She didn't understand his desperation until it was too late. He grabbed a pistol and shot himself in front of her. His body fell at her feet. She stood, frozen, until the servants tried to talk to her just before dawn. She didn't answer. She just screamed and fled into the winter night. Searchers couldn't figure out where she went. Neighbors found her wandering nearby days later. She still wore only her nightgown and slippers. She fell to the frozen ground near the point of exhaustion. She died a few hours later. She never spoke after they found her. The empty house again grew stigmatized. An army officer named Colonel Bacon purchased the house just after his marriage. He wasn't superstitious, but felt it would be better to prevent anything dubious or dangerous than to take the risk. He moved the whole cottage off the land. He moved the original structure to the junction of Brightwood and Mount Pleasant, where it still stood in the 1910s. He then constructed a mansion atop the land. Most of Washington society braced for tragedy. They were shocked when nothing happened at all. Bacon owned the property for several years with no ill effects. He was then stationed overseas, and the home was leased to the Secretary of the Navy, Benjamin F. Tracy and his wife Delinda. Oddly enough, Tracy's professional predecessor, William C. Whitney, was also known to have a cursed house in New York City. The Hoodoo House seemed again poised to unleash its influence. A neighbor passed the home on the morning of February 3rd, 1890. He noticed the Tracy house was on fire. It was just after 7 a.m. and smoke poured out of the windows. He rang the alarm for the authorities. Mrs. Wilmerding, Tracy's eldest daughter, was just waking when she heard the alarms. She and her daughter, Alice, had stayed the night with her parents. The two leapt from her second-story bedroom window. She sustained severe burns and broke her wrist. Alice sustained injuries in her lower limbs. Delinda Tracy jumped from her bedroom window on the second story. She landed in the concrete courtyard with no outward damage, but sustained internal injuries. She died from an aneurysm an hour later. Mary, another Tracy daughter, was found in the hallway. She had suffocated and was so badly burned she could only be identified by what remained of her dress. The firemen tried to lift her by her wrists to get her body out of the blazing building, but her flesh came off where they touched it. Her French maid, Josephine Morel, had also been immolated in the blaze. Tracy himself was near death from smoke inhalation when he was found. Doctors worked on him for over an hour just so he could breathe without aid. The fire spread quickly but also quietly. All floors were engulfed before anyone noticed. The coroner's jury established on February 19th the fire had no known cause. The staggering loss of life was due to the fire's exceptional speed. Eventually, the authorities attributed the tragedy to the butler overfilling the furnace with coal oil. Even those who just witnessed the fire were said to be victims of the home's malignancy. Annie Kamak, a neighbor, witnessed Mrs. Tracy's leap into the courtyard. She died months later on May 3, 1890. She'd been so shaken by what she witnessed that she went mad. Her family took her on vacation to try to alleviate her despondency. She died in Athens, Georgia. While months had passed since the blaze, her death was still attributed to the house fire. Tracy was through with the house. He decided just to sell. The fire-damaged home was sold on May 6, 1890. Although Tracy purchased the home for $50,000 and invested another $20,000 in renovations, he only got $30,000 for the property. The next owner was Augustus Cleveland Tyler. He had the remaining structure removed and rebuilt from the basement up. The bad luck was not shaken because the structure was lost. As soon as the family moved in, the home went under quarantine. A maid somehow came down with scarlet fever. Mrs. Tyler volunteered to look after her, so she put her on the topmost story. The damage was already done. Their friends and colleagues were so afraid of the home's history and the sudden disease that everyone refused to visit. The Tylers grew bored with life in a house no one would visit, so they sold out and moved on. This mansion was believed to also be called the Reed Mansion. The home was afterward purchased by the Seth Barton French family, but they couldn't keep servants any more than the Tyler family. The servants feared the ghosts. Baron Roman Romanovich Rosen, of the great empire of the Slavs, purchased the home from the French family. The Russian ambassador wanted to live in the historic house, but his wife had grown up in Washington and knew the home's history. She refused. The family moved on, and the house again fell into abandonment. As Washington's urban development continued, the mansion was again purchased in 1913. The commercial club bought the property and invested $120,000 in creating a brand new facility. The address by this time was 1634 I Street Northwest. The area's paranormal activity fell into obscurity after this point, although strange events still happened. In March of 1914, the club's young bartender, Arthur Wrightsell, was found dead in his bedroom. The 26-year-old died of asphyxiation hours earlier. In 1915, commercial club orderly, Frank Murphy, somehow fell out of the third-story window. He sustained a fractured right ankle, but otherwise survived. Whatever did or didn't happen in the new club, it didn't last long. The club left the property in 1919. The house's location on the south side of Farragut Square is a commercial and business district today. The location once known as the Hoodoo House in Washington, D.C., which had various names like the Tracy House and Tyler House, is now occupied by Tyler House Apartments.
Well, you may not realize that one of the most iconic buildings in the district is one of the most haunted.
Legend has it that the U.S. Capitol is said to be a seemingly haunted place. One of the main reasons the military converted the Capitol building into a field hospital for Union soldiers during the Civil War. And some have reported sightings of those soldiers wandering the building, even.
Some of them have continued to stay here. A lot of soldiers died here, and they were very idealistic at that point, and their spirits would be here.
All right, but that's fun, but the scariest thing going on in the Capitol is maybe by some of the living people that are there right now. Beyond the legendary ghost stories is the Demon Cat story. It appears before national emergencies, such as when the British burned the Capitol in 1814, the Civil War, Pearl Harbor, and President Kennedy's assassination. Its footprints are purportedly visible in the Capitol's Senate wing. In another stairwell, you'll find the blood of Kentucky Congressman William Tabley. Newspaper reporter Charles Kincaid was shot and killed. Tabley there in a dispute back in 1890. Tabley's ghost is said to lurk around the Capitol, periodically tripping reporters as revenge. I don't need help with that. I trip on my own. Some of the stairs are a little worn there. It happens.
Okay.
There's a curvature in the old marble
Well, it could
stairs.
just be clumsiness. I mean, let's...
But, I've heard this about over on Fort McNair.
Yeah.
The Mary Surratt.
That it's
Fort
haunted?
McNair, yeah.
Okay, lots of hauntings. If you're interested, go check it out.
This strange story gained notoriety in the 1880s. One of the oldest homes in Victorian Washington had a romantic tale. The ivy-covered house sat in the eastern part of the city. The structure was derelict and growing worse daily. Whatever money the ancestors held was long lost by the time of that final generation, which consisted of an elderly man, his maid, and her niece. After the ancient clock chimed midnight, a scream developed that sounded like the yowl of a cat. It was faint at first, but slowly grew louder. It turned into a woman's scream before it abruptly stopped. The phantom lady of the manor then descended the main stairway. She walked slowly because her ghostly gown had a train. She was always enveloped by a white mist. The maid, who was essentially the lady of the home, refused to follow the ghost beyond the steps. She believed that if a spirit smiled at you, you would be paralyzed. The story began with a fine family who occupied the house during the Revolutionary War, ancestors of the elderly gentleman. His great-aunt fell in love with a Revolutionary War officer. To her horror, he married another woman. She grieved herself to death. She became the skeletal figure that haunted the home's corridor.
I've been here almost 25 years. I've only had one experience upstairs, and it was back during the Reagan administration. And normally we have a gentleman that works here in the evenings that turns out all the lights at the First Family's request, and we kind of shut the place down for the night. And he was out sick that night, so I was doing his job, and I'd gone upstairs and had turned out lights in a number of rooms, went to the Lincoln bedroom, and there's a chandelier there that had a light switch that was a dimmer, the type that you just push it and it turns it off and resets. So I turned that light off, turned out some other lights, went into a series of other rooms, went across the hallway into what's called the Queen's bedroom. And as I came out of the Queen's bedroom, I was looking directly into a darkened Lincoln bedroom, and all of a sudden the chandelier came back on. And of course I'd been aware of some of the stories and all, so I ran in right away hoping that I'd get to see something or feel something. And really didn't see anything at first. Turned off the chandelier, and then I got a very cold chill. You know, I could definitely feel something. And so I kind of looked around, looked in the mirror, thinking, well, maybe there was something behind me, which of course there wasn't. But without a doubt, I could feel a very cold presence of someone, something there. That's the only time that light had ever done that to anybody. I checked with our electricians, and I'd turned that light on and off a number of times myself. So that's really the only experience I had, but it was one that I'll never forget, obviously.
It was during the Johnson administration. I was working as a butler at that time. I heard some noise one night around 3 o'clock a.m. in the morning. It was on the 3rd floor, and it seemed like I heard a door close. And I knew there wasn't anyone up there. So I told a friend of mine, which was Frank Young, and I said, well, let's go investigate, see what's up here. So we walked on up, and as I reached around to flip the light on, he ran. But I just stayed there. I said, there's nothing back here. I don't see anything. So that's all I heard. It was just something like a door closed. And I knew it was no one on the 3rd floor. We didn't have no house guests at all. It was just him and I.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, comment, and share to keep fascinating content coming here at Nightmare Nexus.